Hey guys, tonight I want to start with something that is not in any of the books. You read the Little House books, or you watch the show, or you grew up with the fiddle and the prairie and the lamp in the window. You think you know the story. Laura, Mary, Carrie, Grace, Ma, and Pa. The big woods, the prairie, the long winter, the girl who grew up to write it all down. Here is what you were not told. Between the 4th book and the 5th book, between the last day at Plum Creek and the first day at Silver Lake, the Ingalls family lost a year. They lost a town, they lost a child, and then they spent the next 60 years pretending none of it had happened. The books skip it. The television show skips it. The tourist brochures mostly skip it. The official Laura Ingalls Wilder historic sites in Pepin and Walnut Grove and De Smet and Mansfield do not mention it on the front page. You have to go looking for it. Most people never go looking. The child was a boy. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. Everyone in the family called him Freddie. He was the 4th child of Charles and Caroline Ingalls. He was their only son. He was born on the 1st of November, 1875, in a sod dugout on the banks of Plum Creek in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. He died on the 27th of August, 1876, at the farm of his Uncle Peter, near a town called South Troy, in Wabasha County, Minnesota. He was 9 months old. He never appears in any of the 9 Little House books. The town he died in does not appear. The town the family moved to after he died does not appear. The hotel his mother worked in does not appear. The saloon next door to the hotel does not appear. The fire does not appear. The new baby his mother was already carrying when she buried him does not appear in the place where she should appear, on the calendar she should appear on. The books jump from Minnesota to Dakota Territory, as if the family had simply folded a map and stepped across the fold. They did not step across a fold. They crossed 170 miles of mud in a covered wagon going the wrong direction, east, away from the frontier, carrying a dead baby in their memory and a live baby in Caroline's belly. And they landed in a town that Laura Ingalls Wilder would later describe, in the only writing she ever did about it, as small and dirty. That is the year we are going to open tonight. I am going to tell you what happened in the year the books skip. I am going to tell you about the baby. I am going to tell you about the hotel, the saloon, the fire, the Midnight Flit, and the new baby who arrived in the middle of all of it. I am going to tell you what Laura wrote about her brother once, in a manuscript she could not sell, and what she did not write about him in the 9 books she could. And I am going to tell you what the family carried for the next 50 years, in the silence between the lines of the books that made them American scripture. If you are the kind of person who would rather know the true version than the comfortable one, do me one small favour and tap subscribe. That is the only kind of story I tell here. The slow kind. The kind with the receipts. And I would like you along for it. Because here is the thing about the books you grew up with. They are not lies. Laura Ingalls Wilder was a careful woman, and an honest one, and almost everything in those books is grounded in something that actually happened to her. The problem is not what she put in. The problem is what she left out. And the largest thing she left out is the thing that almost broke her family in half. She told us about it. Once. In her own handwriting. In a single passage in a manuscript she wrote in 1930, when she was 63 years old, sitting at a desk in Mansfield, Missouri, trying to remember a summer day in 1876 when she was 9 years old, and a baby brother stopped breathing in front of her. The manuscript was rejected by publishers. She rewrote it as children's books. The children's books did not have a baby brother in them. They did not have a death in them. They did not have a town called Burr Oak in them. They did not have a hotel in them. They did not have a saloon in them. The manuscript sat in a drawer at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, for more than 80 years. In 2014, the South Dakota Historical Society Press finally published it, edited by a Wilder scholar named Pamela Smith Hill under the title Pioneer Girl, the Annotated Autobiography. It became a bestseller. Most of the people who bought it never finished it. The passage about Freddie is on a page near the middle. It is short. It is the only time Laura ever put the moment into words. We will get to that passage. We will get to it slowly. because the weight of it depends on knowing what came before it, and what came after it, and what was happening in the room when she wrote it. Sit with this for a second. A 9-year-old girl on a Minnesota farm in the summer of 1876. A baby brother she had helped name. A baby brother she had carried around the yard. A baby brother she had watched her mother nurse. And then one afternoon, the baby is not well. The doctor comes. The baby gets worse. And one awful day, as Laura would later write, the baby straightened out his little body and was dead. That is the sentence. That is the whole sentence. She wrote it once. She never wrote it again. Let me show you what was around that sentence. Let me show you the family before Freddie died, so you can feel the size of the hole he left. Picture the family in the spring of 1875. Charles Ingalls is 39 years old. He's lean, dark-haired, restless, with a long jaw and a habit of looking past whoever he is talking to, out toward the horizon. He plays the fiddle. He hates debt. He loves open land. He has moved his family 4 times in 10 years, from Wisconsin to Kansas to Wisconsin again to Minnesota, and every move has been sold to his wife and daughters as the one that will finally work. Caroline Lake Ingalls is 35. She is small, careful, neat, and quiet. She was raised fatherless after her father, Henry Quiner, went down with a schooner on Lake Michigan in November of 1845, and she has spent her entire adult life building the kind of order that her own mother never had time to build. She's the brake on Charles's wagon. She is also the one who has to do the packing every time he decides to move again. They have 3 daughters. Mary Amelia is 10. She is the quiet one, the neat one, the one Caroline recognizes herself in. Laura Elizabeth is 8. She is the loud one, the watcher, the one who remembers everything and never forgets a face. Carrie, Caroline Celestia, is 4. She is small, often sickly, and she will be small and often sickly for her entire life. What the family does not have is a son. On a frontier farm in 1875, this matters in ways that are easy to forget now. A son is labour. A son is a future. A son carries the family name. A son, on a claim with no neighbours for miles, is the difference between a homestead that survives the father and a homestead that dies with him. Charles had grown up with brothers. Caroline had grown up with a brother who died in the Civil War. The absence of a son in their household was not a tragedy. It was a structural problem. So, when Caroline got pregnant again in early 1875, the household held its breath in a way that the books never quite capture. The baby was born on the 1st of November 1875. He was delivered almost certainly in the dugout on Plum Creek, with Caroline lying on a bed that Charles had built, and a neighbour woman helping, because there was no doctor within an easy ride. They named him Charles Frederick. Charles for his father, Frederick for Caroline's stepfather, Frederick Holbrook, the farmer who had married her widowed mother in 1849, and who had helped raise Caroline after her own father was lost on the lake. They called him Freddie. The 1875 Minnesota state census had been taken in May of that year, before Freddie was conceived or before Caroline was visibly pregnant. The enumerator listed Charles, Caroline, Mary, Laura, and Carrie. The family's homestead was in North Hero Township, Redwood County, on 172 acres that Charles had filed on the year before. Freddie was not on the census because Freddie was not yet born, but he was born that November, and by every account that survives, he was the boy Charles had been waiting for. Here is what we do not have. We do not have a photograph of Freddie. We do not have a letter Caroline wrote about his birth. We do not have a single object that can be reliably traced to him. No blanket, no shoe, no lock of hair. The family was poor. Cameras on the Minnesota frontier in 1875 were rare. The baby lived for 9 months and left behind him exactly one physical trace, a single entry in a county death record misspelled, in a book in Wabasha County, Minnesota. What we have instead is the shape of the hole he left. Hold that for a second. The boy was real. He breathed. He had a name. He was the only son. He was the 4th child. He was the baby his parents had been waiting for. And then, 9 months after he was born, on a summer day in 1876 at the farm of his Uncle Peter, He stopped breathing in front of his 9-year-old sister Laura. That is the fact at the centre of tonight's story. Everything else, the hotel, the saloon, the fire, the new baby, the books, the silence, the manuscript in the drawer, the cemetery with no marker, is built around that fact. So let me show you how the family ended up at Uncle Peter's farm that summer with a 9-month-old baby in the middle of a journey they had not planned to be making. The Ingalls family did not leave Walnut Grove because they wanted to. They left because the sky turned brown, and the sky stayed brown for 3 years. The Rocky Mountain locust plagues began in the summer of 1873. On the 12th of June that year, farmers in southwestern Minnesota looked up and saw what they thought was a snowstorm coming. It was not snow. It was the first major swarm. The locust came down out of the Rocky Mountains, rode the thermals east, and ate everything green between the Dakotas and Iowa. Wheat, oats, corn, barley, the stems, the leaves, the handles of the hoes left leaning in the field. They ate the wool off the sheep. They ate the clothes drying on the line. When the locusts had eaten everything they could eat, they laid their eggs in the soil and died. The next summer, the eggs hatched, and the new swarm, hungrier than the last, came up out of the ground and started again. The plague lasted, in waves, from 1873 through 1877. The 1874 swarm alone caused something close to $50 million in crop losses across a dozen Great Plains states and territories. The Ingalls family arrived in Walnut Grove in February of 1874, just in time for the second wave. They had come from Pepin, Wisconsin. Charles had filed on 172 acres in North Hero Township, Redwood County, on the preemption law, which meant he had to live on the land and improve it for a fixed period before he could buy it. He built a dugout into the bank of Plum Creek. He broke sod. He planted wheat. The first summer was the summer the locusts came back. The books tell you about the grasshoppers. On the banks of Plum Creek, the fourth Little House book, published in 1937, has a chapter about them. Laura was honest about the swarm. She described the sound. She described the way the sky went dark. She described the way the wheat came down. What she did not describe in the book was what the grasshoppers did to her family over the next 2 years. They broke them. By the summer of 1875, Charles Ingalls was carrying debt. The wheat crop had failed. The oats had failed. The corn had been eaten down to the soil. He had borrowed against the next year's crop, and the next year's crop had been eaten too. Carolyn was pregnant with Freddie through the worst of it. In a dugout with no insulation, in a Minnesota winter, with 3 daughters under the age of 10. The 1875 state census, taken in May, lists the family as still on the claim. Freddie was born that November. The crop that summer was gone before it came up. By the spring of 1876, Charles had to make a decision the books never describe. He could stay in Walnut Grove and try 1 more year, which meant going further into debt to the store and the bank, or he could sell the claim, take whatever he could get for it, and go somewhere else. He had a friend, a man named William Stedman, who had already left Walnut Grove the year before and had bought a hotel in a small town in northeast Iowa, a town called Burr Oak. Stedman had written to Charles. He needed help running the hotel. He could offer Charles a wage, not a large one, and a room in the basement for the family. It was not a westward move. The frontier Charles Ingalls had been chasing his entire adult life ran west. Burr Oak, Iowa, was east. It was backtracking. It was the kind of move a man makes when he has run out of moves. Charles sold the claim in August of 1876. He got very little for it. He loaded the wagon, he put the canvas on, he put his wife and his 3 daughters and his 9-month-old son into the box of the wagon, and he pointed the team east. But here is the part the books do not tell you. The family did not go straight to Burr Oak. They went south and east first, to a rented farm in Wabasha County, Minnesota, near a town called South Troy, where Charles's older brother Peter Riley Ingalls was living with his wife Eliza. They went there for the summer. They went because the wagon needed repairs before the longer trip to Iowa. They went because Peter had offered them a place to stay. They went because the baby was not well. That last detail is the one that matters. The baby was not well. Laura, in her Pioneer Girl manuscript wrote that Freddie, quote, was not well, end quote, when the family arrived at Uncle Peter's. She does not say what was wrong with him. She does not say whether he had been sick before they left Walnut Grove or whether he got sick on the road. She does not say whether Caroline had been carrying him on a pillow or in her arms. She does not say whether Charles was already worried. All she says is that the baby was not well. And then she says the doctor came, and then she says what happened next. Here is what the country looked like. Wabasha County in late July of 1876 was green, wooded, river-bottom country. Nothing like the flat prairie of Walnut Grove. The Zumbro River cut through limestone bluffs. The bottomland was heavy with silt. The trees were oak and maple and basswood, the same trees the Ingalls family had known in the big woods of Wisconsin, the trees Laura had been born under. The farm Peter rented sat on a bend in the river. The house was a frame house, painted white, with a porch across the front. There was a barn, a kitchen garden, a well with a wooden cover, a path down to the river. The grass in the yard was tall enough to brush a 9-year-old's knees. It was, by every standard that mattered on the frontier, a comfortable place. Peter and Eliza had enough. They were not rich, but they were not broken. They had survived the grasshopper plagues because the plagues had not reached as far east as Wabasha County. They had food in the cellar. They had hay in the barn. They had a working team. They had, in the way that the Ingalls brothers had always had for each other, an open door for Charles and his family. Laura would later remember the summer at Peter's as the last summer before everything changed. She did not write that down in those exact words, but it is the shape of what she did write. This summer at Uncle Peter's was the summer the family was still, briefly intact. The baby was alive. Mary could see. Carrie was small and well. Caroline was whole. Charles was rested. The wagon was parked. For a few weeks, in a borrowed house on a river bottom in southeast Minnesota, the Ingalls family was the family the books would later describe. Then the baby got sick. That is the part the books skip. That is the part that did not fit. The books could absorb grasshoppers. The books could absorb a long winter. The books could even, eventually, absorb a sister going blind, although they changed the cause. The books could not absorb a healthy baby dying in a borrowed room in a stranger's house. In a summer, the family was supposed to be between homes, on the way to a town the books would never mention. So the summer was cut, and the baby was cut, and the town was cut, and the silence was the book. Here is what was happening in the days before the doctor came. The days before are the part that makes the doctor's visit land. We are going to sit with that for one more minute before we open that page of the manuscript, because the doctor who came, a man named most likely Harvey Rogers, who practiced in Zumbro Falls, came on horseback to a rented farm on a summer day in 1876. He came into a farmhouse that did not belong to the Ingalls family. He came into a room where Caroline was sitting with a baby she had been nursing for 9 months. He came into a room where a 9-year-old girl named Laura was standing against the wall watching. The doctor did what doctors did in 1876, which was almost nothing that we would recognise as medicine. He may have given the baby a tincture. He may have bled him. He may have told Caroline to keep him warm. He may have told her to keep him cool. Whatever he did, it did not work. And then, on the 27th of August, in the county of Wabasha, in the state of Minnesota, in a country that was itself only 100 years old, a 9-month-old baby named Charles Frederick Ingalls, called Freddie by his family, called Fred by the county clerk who would record his death 2 days later, straightened out his little body and was dead. Here are the next 90 days. What the family did in the 90 days after Freddie died is the part of the story that the books could not absorb. The books would have had to stop. The books would have had to sit with the silence. The books would have had to admit that the wagon kept going, east, into a town the family had no business being in, with a mother who was already pregnant with the next baby, and a 9-year-old girl who had just watched her brother die. The books could not do that. So the books skipped it. And the skip is the story we're going to fill in tonight. The first thing to understand about the summer of 1876 is that the Ingalls family was not, in any meaningful sense, homeless yet. They were between homes. They had sold the farm at Walnut Grove. They had not yet arrived at Burr Oak. They were living out of a wagon and a borrowed bedroom at Peter Ingalls' farm. Peter Riley Ingalls was Charles's older brother. He was the eldest of the Ingalls brothers, the one who had stayed closer to the family's Wisconsin roots while Charles had wandered. Peter had married a woman named Eliza Ann. They had a rented farm on the Zumbro River in Zumbro Township, Wabasha County, about 120 miles northeast of Walnut Grove. The Ingalls brothers had grown up together in the big woods of Wisconsin. They had moved together to Illinois, then to Kansas, then back to Wisconsin. Charles was the restless one. Peter was the steady one. Peter had land. Charles had a wagon. When Charles's crops failed for the third year, Peter was the brother who took him in. The farm was on a bend in the Zumbro River. The land was wooded. The soil was bottomland, dark, heavy with silt from spring floods. Peter and Eliza had a frame house, not a dugout. They had a barn. They had a kitchen garden. They had a well. By the standards of the frontier in 1876, they were comfortable. The Ingalls family arrived in July of 1876. We do not know the exact date. We do know they were there in time for the August heat. We know they were there on the 27th of August, the day Freddie died. We know they stayed through September, because Charles needed that long to get the wagon ready for the trip to Iowa. What we do not have is any description of what those weeks were like. Laura never wrote them down. Caroline never wrote them down. Mary never wrote them down. We have no letter from Charles to Peter, no letter from Caroline to Eliza, no diary, no daily record. The 30 days between the family's arrival at South Troy and Freddie's death are, in the historical record, almost entirely silent. Here is what we can reconstruct from the physical evidence and from what Laura did write down later. The family would have slept in a single room. Peter and Eliza's house was a small frame house, probably 2 rooms downstairs and a loft. 5 Ingalls plus 2 Ingalls already there. Caroline would have helped Eliza in the kitchen. Charles would have helped Peter in the fields. Mary, Laura and Carrie would have played in the yard down by the river in the trees. Freddie would have been carried. He was 9 months old. He was not walking. He was probably not crawling well. He was at the age where he was starting to sit up, to reach for things, to recognize faces. Caroline would have nursed him. Laura would have held him. Mary would have played with him. Carrie would have been told not to bother him. The 1875 Minnesota State Census had found the family still in Walnut Grove. The 1880 federal census would find them in Dakota Territory. Between those 2 records, the family was at South Troy for a few weeks, in the summer of 1876, and at Burr Oak, Iowa, for 15 months between October of 1876 and January of 1878. There is no census that captures either of those moments. The family was, in a sense, off the books. Here is what Laura wrote in Pioneer Girl decades later about the summer at Uncle Peter's. Quote, "We went to Uncle Peter's. Little brother Freddie was not well and the doctor came. I thought that would cure him, as it had cured Ma. But little brother got worse instead of better, and one awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead." End quote. That is the whole passage. 2 sentences. Read it again in your head. I thought that would cure him, as it had cured Ma. That is a child's logic. The doctor came for Ma once, and Ma got better. The doctor came for Freddie, and Freddie did not get better. The child watching could not make that fit. The child carried that non-fit for the rest of her life. The woman, 63 years old, sitting at a desk in Missouri, wrote it down once. Then she closed the manuscript. Then she wrote 9 children's books that did not have Freddie in them. That is not the act of a careless woman. That is the act of a woman who knew exactly what she was leaving out, and why. Now, the days after. The 27th of August, 1876, was the day. What came after is the part that makes the rest of the story possible. The doctor who came to Uncle Peter's farm that August was almost certainly a man named Harvey Rogers. He lived and practiced in Zumbro Falls, a few miles north of South Troy. He would have ridden out on horseback. He would have carried a leather bag with him, a few tinctures, a few powders, a syringe for quinine, a scalpel he probably did not use. He was, by every account that survives, a competent country doctor in a county where competent country doctors were scarce. He came because the baby was not well. What was wrong with the baby? We do not know. The Wabasha County Death Record, the official county record, Book A, page 135, lists the cause of death as diarrhea. The clerk wrote the name as Fred Ingalls, the age as 10 months, the date as the 27th of August, 1876, the location as South Troy. Diarrhea, in 1876, was not a small thing. It was one of the leading causes of infant death in the United States. It could be caused by contaminated water, by spoiled milk, by an intestinal infection, by teething, by any of a dozen things that a modern paediatrician would identify in 5 minutes, and a country doctor in 1876 could not identify at all. Babies died of it in cities. Babies died of it on farms. Babies died of it in families that had clean water and families that did not. Laura, in her Pioneer Girl manuscript, gave a different account. She said Freddie, quote, had never been a healthy baby and suffered convulsions before he died, end quote. Convulsions, in 1876, was the word for seizures. A 9-month-old baby having seizures is a baby in serious trouble. The seizures could have been caused by a high fever, by meningitis, by encephalitis, by dehydration from the diarrhea, by any of a dozen things. The county record says one thing. Laura remembered another. Both can be true. A baby with severe diarrhea, dehydrated, feverish, can seize. The doctor may have come, may have tried to bring down the fever, may have failed. The baby may have seized in Caroline's arms. The baby may have seized in Laura's arms. The baby may have seized alone in a crib. Here is what we do not have. We do not have a doctor's report. We do not have a letter from Caroline describing the day. We do not have an obituary. There was no obituary for a 9-month-old baby on the Minnesota frontier in 1876. There was no funeral in any newspaper. The family was not from South Troy. They were passing through. The baby died at a borrowed farm, in a borrowed room, and was buried 2 days later at the nearest cemetery, in a grave that no one in the family would be able to come back to. Here is what we do have. We have the sentence, Laura wrote. One awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead. That sentence is the only first-hand account of Freddie's death that exists. It is the only sentence Laura ever wrote about the moment. It is the only sentence any Ingalls family member ever wrote about the moment. It is the only sentence, period. Sit with that. A moment that large, in a family that large, on a frontier where moments that large happened every week, and there is one sentence. The whole weight of the loss, the whole weight of the silence that would follow, rests on that one sentence. And then the wagon was packed. And then the family got back in. And then Charles pointed the team east toward Iowa. Let me show you the burial, because the burial is the part that the silence was built around. The cemetery is in Section 24 of Zumbro Township, Wabasha County, Minnesota. It is called, in different records, Pleasant Prairie Cemetery, or Dale Cemetery, or South Troy Cemetery. It sits on a low rise above the river bottom, on a patch of ground that has been a cemetery since the 1850s. There is a modern church next to it, the South Troy Wesleyan Church. There is a historical marker. There is, near the church, a replica of the death certificate, mounted so visitors can read it. The cemetery itself is small, a few hundred burials. The oldest stones date to the 1850s. The newest are recent. The Ingalls family Bible, which Laura's parents kept and which is now in private hands, records that Freddie was buried at South Troy. Here is the part that is hard to sit with. We do not know exactly where in the cemetery Freddie is buried. The Ingalls family was passing through. They did not own a plot. They did not buy a plot. They buried the baby in the cemetery, the way families buried babies on the frontier, in whatever corner the cemetery had for strangers' children. There may have been a small wooden marker. There may not have been. If there was a marker, it was wood, and wood does not last 150 years on a Minnesota hillside. The wood is gone. The grave, if it was ever exactly marked, is unmarked now. The South Troy Wesleyan Church, in the 20th century, put up a single memorial stone for Freddie Ingalls near the church entrance. The stone acknowledges that he is buried somewhere in the cemetery. It does not claim to mark the grave. There is one other detail, a single Facebook post from the Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society, mentions that a limestone grave marker for Charles Frederick Ingalls was reportedly made in Burr Oak, Iowa, and that he was buried at the end of the Phelps family row, which has no other Ingalls markers. I have not been able to corroborate this anywhere else. The Phelps family row exists. The Burr Oak connection is plausible because the family did go to Burr Oak next, and limestone was a common Iowa building material. But the only source is one social media post. What we can say with confidence is this: a 9-month-old baby was buried in late August of 1876 in a small cemetery in southeast Minnesota. The family was there for the burial. They could not stay. They had to keep moving. They left a baby in the ground, and they pointed a wagon east. Imagine being Caroline Ingalls on the morning they left South Troy. You have just buried your only son. You're 36 years old. You have 3 daughters under the age of 11. You're pregnant, although you may not know it yet, with your 5th child. You're going to a town you've never seen, to run a hotel you have never been inside, for a wage that you have been told will not be enough. Your husband is driving the wagon. Your brother-in-law Peter is standing in the yard watching you go. Your 9-year-old daughter Laura is sitting in the back of the wagon, looking at the country going past, and she has not spoken about what she saw in that room. You leave South Troy. You do not come back. You will not come back. None of the Ingalls will come back except in memory. The grave stays. The marker, if there was one, rots. The cemetery stays. The town of South Troy, which was never much of a town, slowly disappears. The church is built. The historical marker is put up. The replica death certificate is mounted. Tourists, decades later, stop and read it. Most of them have read the Little House books. Most of them do not know that this is the cemetery where the brother is buried. The drive from South Troy, Minnesota, to Burr Oak, Iowa, is about 140 miles. In a covered wagon in September of 1876 on dirt roads, with 3 children and a pregnant woman, it would have taken something close to a week. The wagon went south first, down through Minnesota, into the driftless country of northeast Iowa. The driftless area is a region that the glaciers missed. It is not flat. It is hills and valleys and creeks and limestone bluffs. It would have been a shock to a family used to the flat prairies of Minnesota. The wagon would have laboured up hills and break down them. The team would have been tired. The family would have been tired. The wagon went through Decorah, Iowa, which was already a real town. The wagon went through the small Norwegian farming communities that dotted the area. The wagon went down into the valley where the village of Burr Oak sat, on a bend in a creek, in a grove of Burr Oak trees. The family arrived in October of 1876. They arrived in a town that was already in decline. They arrived at a hotel that was already failing. They arrived in a place they would live for 15 months and never write a single word about in any of the books that would make them famous. Here is what they walked into. Here is the thing about Burr Oak in 1876. It was a town that the future had already passed by. The village had been platted in 1855, in the early years of Iowa settlement. It sat on a stagecoach road. For about 20 years it had been a real town with 2 hotels, a blacksmith, a general store, a church, a school, a couple of saloons, and a regular flow of emigrant wagons heading west toward the frontier. The town had been built for the stagecoach traffic. Then the railroad came, and the railroad did not come through Burr Oak. The railroad went through Decorah, 12 miles north. The railroad went through Kalmar, 20 miles south. The stagecoach line kept running for a while, connecting Burr Oak to the railway stations, but the traffic dropped year by year. By 1876, the village was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. The 2 hotels were competing for a shrinking pool of travellers. The American House, across the road from the Masters Hotel, was the official stagecoach stop. The Masters Hotel was the other hotel. It was the one that was losing. William Stedman had bought the Masters Hotel in October of 1876, the same month the Ingalls family arrived. Stedman was an English immigrant born in Wolverhampton in 1832, who had come to America in 1857 and had farmed in Minnesota before going broke in the same grasshopper plagues that had broken Charles Ingalls. Stedman had bought the hotel with what was left of his savings, plus the lower level of the saloon building immediately to the south. He had written to Charles Ingalls and asked him to come help run it. The arrangement was this. Charles and Caroline would help run the hotel. In exchange, they would get a room in the basement and a share of the profits. There were no profits. There was a room in the basement. The Masters Hotel was a 1.5-story frame building, built in 1856 with a saltbox roof and a full-width front porch. From the front it looked small. It was not small. It was built into the side of a hill so that the basement at the back was at ground level. The building had, in fact, 3 levels and 11 rooms. The basement had a kitchen, 2 dining rooms, and a small bedroom. The main floor had a parlour, 2 bedrooms, and the former saloon room which Stedman had bought along with the hotel. The upper half-story had 4 boarders' rooms, where the hotel guests slept, 4 men to a room, 2 to a bed, at 25 cents a night. The Ingalls family was given the small bedroom in the basement, 5 of them. Charles, Caroline, Mary, Laura, Carrie. In a single room, in the basement of a hotel, in a town they had never seen, 2 months after they had buried a baby in a cemetery they would never visit again. Pamela Smith Hill, the Wilder scholar, in a blog post she wrote in January of 2021 called Charles Ingalls, Driving Away in Darkness, used a single word to describe what life in Burr Oak was like for the Ingalls family. The word was grim. Here is what grim looked like. The basement bedroom of the Masters Hotel had a low ceiling. It had a single window high on the wall that looked out at the hillside. It had a door that opened into the kitchen. The kitchen was the centre of the building. The kitchen was where Caroline Ingalls would spend most of the next 15 months. The kitchen had a wood-burning cook stove. It had a long pine table where the hotel's meals were prepared. It had a pantry with flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, dried apples, molasses. It had a pump sink, although the water probably came from a well outside. It had hooks on the wall for pots. It had a smell that never left. The smell of bacon, grease and wood smoke and coffee grounds and the warm yeast of bread rising. Caroline Ingalls was 36 years old when she walked into that kitchen. She had been cooking since she was 8. She had cooked over campfires, in fireplaces, on cast-iron stoves, in dugouts. She had cooked for harvest crews. She had cooked for strangers passing through. She was, by every account that survives, a good cook, the kind of cook who could make a meal out of whatever was in the pantry and make it taste like more than the sum of what was in the pantry. Now she was cooking for the guests of a declining hotel in a town the railroad had passed by. The guests were mostly men, drummers, the travelling salesmen of the 1870s were called, stagecoach passengers, labourers between jobs, locals who had nowhere else to eat. They came in hungry, they ate fast, they left. The next meal was 3 hours later. Caroline cooked breakfast, dinner, supper. She cooked for the family. She cooked for the Stedmans. She cooked for the boarders. She cooked for the stagecoach passengers who stopped for a meal between Decorah and Kalmar. She cooked while she was pregnant. Here is the part that the books could not absorb. Caroline Ingalls walked into the Masters Hotel in October of 1876, 2 months after burying her 9-month-old son in a cemetery in another state. She was almost certainly already pregnant with her 5th child. She would have known by November. She would have been showing by January. She would have been heavy by April. She would have given birth on the 23rd of May, 1877, in a rented house in the same town to a daughter they would name Grace Pearl. So in the space of 9 months, between August of 1876 and May of 1877, Caroline Ingalls buried one baby and gave birth to another. She did this in a hotel basement. She did this while cooking for strangers. She did this in a town she had not chosen, in a state she had not chosen, working for a wage that did not cover her family's living expenses. She was 37 years old when Grace was born. Now look at what else was happening in that hotel. The cooking was only part of it. The saloon next door. The saloon was a separate building, immediately south of the hotel, with a connecting door on the lower level that Stedman had acquired along with the hotel. The saloon served the men who came through town. The saloon was loud, the saloon was rough, there was drinking, there was card playing, there was swearing, there were occasional fights. Charles and Caroline Ingalls, by every account that survives, hated the saloon. They were Congregationalists. They were not prudes exactly. Charles drank occasionally, Caroline did not. But the saloon next door was not an occasional drink. The saloon next door was a steady stream of drunk men, walking past the hotel door, sometimes through the hotel door, sometimes up the stairs to the boarders' rooms with bottles in their coats. The Ingalls daughters were 11, 9 and 6. They were living in a basement bedroom one wall away from a saloon. Here is a scene from Pioneer Girl that Pamela Smith Hill has specifically described as one of the not safe for children tales that Laura wrote down once, and then never wrote down again. It happened during the family's time at Burr Oak. A neighbour of the Ingalls family, a man whose name is not given in the published excerpts, had been drinking whiskey. He went up to his bedroom in the hotel. He poured kerosene through the room. He set himself on fire. He burned to death. Charles Ingalls witnessed the immediate aftermath. Charles Ingalls helped carry the body out. The family moved out of the Masters Hotel within days. Pamela Smith Hill, in her commentary on Pioneer Girl, has said that Wilder makes it very clear in the manuscript that her parents worried about the social environment their daughters experienced in Burr Oak. The drinking, the card playing, the swearing, the fire, the incidents that the published excerpts hint at but do not fully describe, the love triangles gone awry, the domestic abuse, the saloon culture that the family was living inside, not next to, inside. This is the year the books skip. This is the year that did not fit the book's thesis, which was that the prairie made families strong, and the frontier was a place of innocent adventure. This year was not innocent. This year was a hotel basement in a declining Iowa town, with a grieving pregnant mother cooking for drunk men, a father who could not earn enough to feed his family, 3 little girls trying to stay out of the way, and a saloon next door that periodically set people on fire. The books could not have been written if this year had stayed in them, so the year was cut. Here is what the family did when the saloon fire made the hotel unlivable. The first move within Burr Oak was to a set of rented rooms above George Kimball's grocery store, 2 doors down from the Masters Hotel. George Kimball was a local merchant. His store was on the main street. The apartment above it was small. The Ingalls family crowded into it. The second move was to a rented brick house on the edge of town, rented from a man named Mr. Bisbee. The house was in a wooded area. It was the house where Grace was born. So between October of 1876 and May of 1877, the Ingalls family lived in 3 different places in Burr Oak. They started in the basement of the hotel. They moved to the apartment over Kimball's grocery. They moved to the Bisbee house. They were not in any of those places at home. Here is what Caroline was doing during those months. She was cooking. 3 meals a day for the family, 3 meals a day for the hotel guests when they were still in the hotel. She was doing laundry. Laundry in 1876 was a full-day job. You drew water. You heated the water in a tub on the stove. You scrubbed the clothes against a washboard with lye soap. You boiled the whites. You rinsed. You wrung. You hung. You took down. You ironed. You folded. You did this for the family. You did this for the hotel guests. You did this for the Stedmans. You did this while your belly was getting bigger every week. She was cleaning. Hotel rooms had to be cleaned every day the hotel had guests. The boarders' rooms on the top floor, 4 small rooms, 2 beds each, had to be made. The sheets had to be changed. The chamber pots had to be emptied. The floors had to be swept. Laura and Mary helped. Laura would later write in Pioneer Girl that she and Mary made the beds in the boarders' rooms. Laura was 9. Mary was 11. They were making the beds of strange men in a hotel in a town they had not chosen. She was pregnant. Caroline was 36 when she arrived in Burr Oak. She was 37 when Grace was born. The pregnancy would have been visible by January. It would have been heavy by March. It would have been difficult by April. She was carrying a baby she had conceived in the same summer she had buried a baby. The baby she was carrying was the replacement, in the family's emotional arithmetic, for the baby she had lost. The baby she was carrying was not a replacement. The baby she was carrying was herself, a new person who would arrive in May and who would be named Grace. Here is the line that William Anderson, the Wilder biographer, found in his research. Anderson, writing in his 1992 biography Laura Ingalls Wilder. A biography recorded that Caroline Ingalls, in private conversations with relatives late in her life, would say, "If Freddie had lived, everything would be different." Anderson noted that she was still saying this nearly 40 years after Freddie's death. Nearly 40 years. Caroline was still saying this in the 19-teens. She was still saying this when her daughters were grown. She was still saying this when Laura was already a published author. She was still saying this when Mary had been blind for 30 years. She was still saying this when the family had finally, after a lifetime of moving, settled into Smet, South Dakota. She was still saying this when Grace, the baby she had been carrying through the Burr Oak year, was a grown woman. 40 years. That is not grief that fades. That is grief that becomes a permanent piece of furniture in the house of a person's mind. Caroline Ingalls carried the loss of her only son for 48 years until she died on the 20th of April 1924 at the home of her daughter, Carrie, in Keystone, South Dakota. She was 84, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Now look at what else was happening in Burr Oak. The hotel was only one piece of it. The man who lit himself on fire was a neighbour. The Pioneer Girl manuscript does not give his name in the published excerpts. He had been drinking whiskey. He went up to his bedroom. He poured kerosene through the room. He set it on fire. Kerosene in 1876 was the standard lamp fuel. It was sold in tins at every general store. It was cheap. It was everywhere. A man with a kerosene lamp and a match could burn down a building in 20 minutes. A man with a kerosene tin and a match could burn himself to death in 5. The man in the bedroom in the Master's Hotel or in the building next to it did not survive. The details, in the published excerpts of Pioneer Girl, are sparse. Pamela Smith-Hill, in commentary, has noted that the scene is one of several in the manuscript that Laura wrote down once and never returned to. The scene was too much for the children's books. The scene was, in some sense, too much for any book. A man getting drunk, going upstairs, pouring kerosene, lighting a match. The horror of it is in the slowness. The man had time to think about what he was doing. The man had time to change his mind. The man did not change his mind. Charles Ingalls was in the building. Charles Ingalls saw the immediate aftermath. Charles Ingalls helped, in some way, with the body. The exact role he played is not in the published record. The family moved out of the Master's Hotel within days. Let me put this in context. The family had arrived in Burr Oak in October of 1876. They had been in the hotel for at most a few months. In that time, they had lived in a basement bedroom one wall away from a saloon. They had listened to drunk men through the wall. They had listened to card games through the wall. They had listened to swearing through the wall. They had watched their father leave every morning to do odd jobs at a feed mill. They had watched their mother cook 3 meals a day for strangers. They had watched their mother's belly get bigger. They had tried, in the way that 9 and 11 and 6-year-old girls try, to stay out of the way. And then a man had set himself on fire in the building they were living in, and their father had helped carry the body out. The books skip this. The books skip all of this. The books go from the banks of Plum Creek to the shores of Silver Lake. The books skip the saloon, the fire, the basement bedroom, the grocery store apartment, the Bisbee house, the birth of Grace, the doctor's wife, the Midnight Flit. The books skip an entire year and a half of the family's life. The skip is not an oversight. The skip is a choice. Laura made the choice. Rose Wilder Lane, Laura's daughter, helped her make the choice. They made the choice because the year did not fit the books. The books were about optimism. The books were about resilience. The books were about a family that survived the prairie because the prairie was where they belonged. The year in Burr Oak was about a family that did not belong anywhere, that had been broken by the prairie, that had buried a baby and run from a saloon fire and given birth in a rented brick house and skipped out on rent in the middle of the night. The skip is the story. The skip is what we are filling in tonight. The skip is what Laura wrote down once, in Pioneer Girl, and then never wrote down again. Here is the doctor's wife. Because the doctor's wife is the scene that, more than any other, tells you how close this family came to not surviving Burr Oak intact. The rented brick house from Mr. Bisbee was on the edge of town. It was in a wooded area. The woods were oak and hickory. There was a creek nearby. There was a small barn. The house was brick, which meant it was a step up from the hotel basement. It had a real kitchen. It had a real bedroom. It had a parlour. The family moved there in the spring of 1877. Caroline was 8 months pregnant. Charles was working at the feed mill and doing odd jobs. Mary and Laura were going to school. The teacher was a man named William H. Reed, an elocutionist, whom Laura would later credit with giving her training in public speaking that she was grateful for the rest of her life. Reed was, by every account, a good teacher. The school was the one bright spot in the Burr Oak year. Grace Pearl Ingalls was born on the 23rd of May, 1877. She was born in the Bisbee house. Caroline was 37. The birth was almost certainly attended by a local doctor, probably Dr. Starr, and by Caroline's neighbour women. So here is the household in May of 1877. Charles, 41. Caroline, 37, recovering from childbirth. Mary, 11. Laura, 10. Carrie, 6. Grace, newborn. 5 children, 2 adults, in a rented brick house on the edge of a declining Iowa town. The family had been in Burr Oak for 7 months. They had moved 3 times within the town. They had buried a baby in another state. They had given birth to a baby in this one. They had survived a saloon fire. They had survived a winter in a hotel basement. They had survived the drinking and the swearing and the rough men next door. Here is what Grace's birth meant, in the family's emotional arithmetic. Grace was not Freddie. Grace was not a replacement. Grace was herself, a new person, a daughter, the 5th and last child. But Grace arrived in the same window of time that Freddie had left, and the family could not help but hold the 2 events side by side. Caroline, who had nursed Freddie through his 9 months, who had carried him in her body for 9 months before that, who had watched him straighten out his little body and stop breathing, was now nursing a new baby. The new baby was in her arms. The old baby was in a cemetery in another state. The new baby needed her. The old baby was beyond needing anyone. The family did not talk about this. The family did not have the language for it. The frontier did not have the language for it. The grief was private. The grief was carried in the way Caroline held Grace, in the way she checked on Grace in the night, in the way she watched Grace breathe. The grief was carried in the things Caroline did not say. Laura saw this. Laura was 10 years old, turning 10 that February, watching her mother hold a new baby in a rented brick house on the edge of a declining Iowa town. Laura did not say anything either. Laura watched. Laura remembered. Laura, 50 years later, would sit down at a desk in Missouri and try to write it. She would write the sentence about Freddie. She would not write the sentence about Grace. She would not write the sentence about Caroline holding Grace in the same arms that had held Freddie. Some things were too heavy to put into words, even for a woman who made her living putting things into words. So Grace grew up in the family without knowing fully what she had been born into. Grace grew up as the baby. Grace grew up as the daughter who was always in the shadow of older sisters. Grace grew up without a brother she never met, in a family that did not mention him, in a house that did not have his name in it. Grace would die in 1941, at the age of 64, having spent her entire life as the daughter who came after the son who was gone. They had not, however, survived financially. Charles's wages at the feed mill did not cover the family's living expenses. The family owed rent on the Bisbee house. They owed money at George Kimball's grocery store. They owed money at the hotel. The landlord, Mr. Bisbee, was not willing to extend the rent. Charles could see, by the late summer of 1877, that the Burr Oak experiment was not going to work. The hotel was failing. The Stedmans were preparing to give up and move south. The town could not support 2 hotels, and the town could not support Charles Ingalls. Here is the scene that, more than any other, captures how close this family came to not coming out of Burr Oak. There was a doctor in Burr Oak. His name, almost certainly, was Dr. Starr. His wife was named Eunice Starr. Eunice Starr did not have children of her own. She was, by every account, a kind woman. She watched the Ingalls family. She watched them through the winter of 1876 and 1877. She watched Caroline working in the hotel kitchen. She watched the 3 little girls. She watched the new baby arrive in May. She watched Charles come home from the feed mill with wages that did not cover the rent. And then, at some point in the late spring or early summer of 1877, Eunice Starr did something that the books could not have absorbed. She went to Caroline Ingalls and she offered to take Laura. Pamela Smith Hill, in her Charles Ingalls. Driving Away in Darkness blog post describes the scene. Eunice Starr offered to adopt Laura. She offered to take her off Caroline's hands. She offered to raise Laura as her own. She was not offering a summer visit. She was not offering to help with the baby. She was offering to remove one of the daughters from the household, permanently, because the household could not feed the daughters it had. Caroline refused. We do not have Caroline's exact words. We do not have Eunice's exact words. We have Pamela Smith Hill's account of the scene, which is based on the Pioneer Girl manuscript and on family tradition. The refusal was, by every account, polite but firm. Caroline was not going to give her daughter away. Caroline was not going to let the Burr Oak year take one of her children the way it had taken Freddie. But the offer had been made. The offer had been necessary in Eunice's mind to make. The offer was an acknowledgement by a neighbour that the family was visibly failing. A doctor's wife, in a small town, did not offer to take a neighbour's child unless the neighbour's situation was bad enough that the neighbour's child was, in the neighbour's view, in some kind of trouble. Laura was 9, then 10 during the Burr Oak year. She was the daughter who helped in the hotel. She was the daughter who made beds for strange men. She was the daughter who carried water, swept floors, watched the baby, ran errands. She was, in the family's economy, a worker. She was also, in Eunice Starr's view, a child who could have a better life somewhere else. Caroline said no. Charles said nothing, or said nothing that survived. The family kept Laura. The family kept all 3 daughters. The family kept the new baby. The family stayed together. Here is the thing about Laura that the books cannot absorb either. Laura was 9 years old during the Burr Oak year. 9. She turned 10 in February of 1877, in the hotel, in the basement, in the middle of the Iowa winter. She was the watcher. She was the daughter who remembered. She was the daughter who, 50 years later, would sit down at a desk in Mansfield, Missouri, and try to write it all down. What did Laura see? In the basement of the Masters Hotel, between October of 1876 and the spring of 1877. She saw her mother cook 3 meals a day for strangers. She saw her father leave every morning to do odd jobs at a feed mill. She saw her sister Mary, 11 years old, neat and careful, helping in the kitchen. She saw Carrie, 6, small and quiet, playing in the corner. She saw the saloon next door. She heard the saloon next door. She smelled the saloon next door. She saw drunk men in the hallway. She saw drunk men at the dinner table. She saw drunk men on the stairs. She made beds for drunk men on the top floor of the hotel, 4 small rooms, 2 beds each, at 25 cents a night. She carried water for the drunk men. She emptied chamber pots for the drunk men. She was 9. She also saw in some form the man who lit himself on fire. She did not, in the published excerpts of Pioneer Girl, describe the fire itself. She described the aftermath. The man had been drinking whiskey. He had poured kerosene through his bedroom. He had set it on fire. He had burned to death. Charles had helped with the body. Laura, 9 years old, watched her father help carry a burned body out of a building the family was living in. Laura, 9 years old, watched her mother move the family out of that building within days. Laura, 9 years old, watched her mother, 6 months pregnant, carry a chamber pot down a flight of stairs and load it into a wagon. That is the Laura the books cannot absorb. The books have Laura, the spunky pioneer girl. The books have Laura, the watcher of the prairie. The books have Laura, the child who loved her father and loved the land and loved the fiddle in the lamplight. The books do not have Laura, the 9-year-old girl in a hotel basement in Iowa, watching her family come apart. That Laura is in Pioneer Girl. That Laura is on a page most readers will never open. But the offer had been made, and the offer stayed in Laura's mind. Laura, in her Pioneer Girl manuscript, mentioned it. She mentioned Mrs. Starr putting her arm around her. She mentioned, in the way that an aging woman mentions a thing that happened when she was 9, the offer that her mother had refused. The family was, by the summer of 1877, a family that other people were trying to give their children away from. That is the sentence. Read it again. The family was, by the summer of 1877, a family that other people were trying to give their children away from. That is the family that the Little House books could not absorb. The books could not have a scene in which a neighbour offers to take Laura away because the family is too poor to keep her. The books could not have a scene in which Caroline, the steady, neat, careful mother, has to refuse to give up her daughter. The books could not have a scene in which the family's poverty is visible enough that the neighbours are intervening. So, the book skipped Burr Oak. The book skipped all of it. The book skipped the hotel, the saloon, the fire, the birth of Grace, the doctor's wife, the offer, the midnight flit that was about to come. The book skipped an entire year and a half of the family's life because the year and a half did not fit the book's thesis. The skip is the story. Here is the midnight flit. The Ingalls family left Burr Oak in January of 1878. The winter of 1877 and 1878 was, in the upper Midwest, the year without a winter. It was the mildest winter of the 19th century in Minnesota. December of 1877 brought almost no snow. There was rain. There was fog. The temperatures stayed near freezing, sometimes above. The soil never froze. Farmers were still ploughing in December. The Minnesota state weather records, which go back to 1819, do not record another winter like it until the 20th century. The same weather pattern affected northeast Iowa. The roads in January of 1878 were mud. They were not snow. They were not ice. They were mud. The Ingalls family in the middle of January, in the middle of the night, loaded the wagon. They put the canvas on. They put the children in. They left the Bisbee house. They left the keys, if there were keys. They left the town. Pamela Smith Hill, in her Charles Ingalls, Driving Away in Darkness blog post, is the source for the language of the midnight departure. Hill describes Charles loading the wagon under cover of darkness, rousting the children out of bed and driving away. Hill's blog post does not specifically attribute the midnight flit to Burr Oak, but the context, the debts, the refused rent extension, the failing hotel, the family with no other options, makes the Burr Oak attribution the most reasonable reading. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society, on its Facebook page, has been more direct. The Society has stated that the Ingalls family fled Burr Oak in the middle of the night to avoid resolving a rent dispute. The family left in the middle of the night because they could not pay what they owed. They owed rent on the Bisbee house. They owed money at George Kimball's grocery. They owed money probably to the Stedmans. The landlord would not extend. Charles could not pay, so Charles loaded the wagon and drove away. The wagon went north. It went back through northeast Iowa. It went back through southern Minnesota. It went back to Walnut Grove. The family that had left Walnut Grove in August of 1876 with a baby returned to Walnut Grove in January of 1878 without the baby, with a new baby, with 15 months of Burr Oak behind them, with debts they had skipped out on, with no farm and no house to go back to. They moved in with friends. The friends, whose name I do not have, shared their house. Charles found work in a store. The family lived in town, not on a farm. They had given up the homesteading dream, at least for the moment. They had come back to Walnut Grove because Walnut Grove was the last place that had been a home, and because they had nowhere else to go. Here is what came next. Because the Burr Oak year was not, it turned out, the worst year the Ingalls family would live through. The worst year was coming. And it would come less than 13 months after they got back to Walnut Grove. In February of 1879, Mary Ingalls, age 14, took sick. The books would later say it was scarlet fever. Scarlet fever has a particular signature, a rough red rash, a strawberry tongue, a specific progression from sore throat to fever to rash. The surviving descriptions of Mary's illness do not match that signature. In 2013, a paediatrician named Dr. Beth Torini, who had grown up reading the Little House books and wondering about Mary's blindness, published a paper in the journal Pediatrics. The paper argued that Mary's blindness was almost certainly not caused by scarlet fever. The paper argued that the symptom pattern in the surviving descriptions, what there are of them, fit viral meningoencephalitis much more closely. Meningoencephalitis is an inflammation of the brain and the membranes around it. It can be caused by a virus. It can cause a high fever, a headache, a stiff neck, a deterioration of the nervous system, and in severe cases a permanent loss of sight. The doctors in 1879 had a plainer name for it: brain fever. Brain fever was the phrase that appeared in obituaries. Mary did not die. Mary lost her sight. The loss was, by every account, complete and permanent. She was 14. She had been the neat one, the careful one, the one Caroline recognised herself in. She had been the daughter the family was quietly building a future around. She had been the daughter who was going to go to college, who was going to teach, who was going to marry, who was going to have the kind of future that frontier families sacrificed for. That future was gone. The future was gone in February of 1879, in a frame house in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, in the same town the family had fled 18 months earlier, after the same grasshopper plagues that had driven them out had finally ended. Mary's blindness was not caused by anything the family had done. Mary's blindness was not caused by Burr Oak. Mary's blindness was not caused by the Saloon fire, or the doctor's wife, or the Midnight Flit. Mary's blindness was, almost certainly, a viral infection, a random event, a thing that happened to a 14-year-old girl on a winter day in southern Minnesota. But the calendar is the calendar, and the calendar is this. August of 1876, Freddie dies. October of 1876 to January of 1878, the family's in Burr Oak. February of 1879, Mary goes blind. The family had lost a baby. The family had lost a daughter's sight. The family had lost a farm. The family had lost a hotel. The family had lost a year and a half of their lives to a town they would never write about. The family had 18 months between Mary's blindness and the next move. 18 months in Walnut Grove. 18 months in which Charles tried, one more time, to make a go of it. 18 months in which Carolyn took care of a newly blind teenager, 3 other daughters, and a husband who was, by every account, increasingly desperate. In September of 1879, Charles Ingalls took a job with the railroad. The family moved west to Dakota Territory, to a town that would become De Smet. The family would finally, after 20 years of moving, settle there. But before they left Walnut Grove, before Mary went blind, before any of the De Smet years, before the long winter, before Laura met Almanzo, before any of the books that would make the family famous, the Burr Oak year was already sitting in the family's memory like a sealed room. None of them talked about it. None of them wrote about it. None of them, as far as the historical record shows, ever went back. Here is what Laura did with that sealed room, because Laura did not, in the end, leave it entirely sealed. She opened it once, she wrote one passage, and then she closed it again, and the book she wrote instead would sell 60 million copies and become an American religion. Skip ahead 2 years. The family is in Dakota Territory. It is the summer of 1881. Laura is 14. Mary, blind now for 2 years, is 17. The family has decided to send Mary to a school for the blind. The school is in Vinton, Iowa. It is called the Iowa College for the Blind. It is one of the better schools for the blind in the United States in 1881. The family has picked it because it is the school that takes students from Dakota Territory. The family has picked it because it is the school that will give Mary a future. The school costs money. The family does not have money. The family has, in Dakota Territory, a homestead, a claim shanty, a garden, a team of horses, and a father who is working for the railroad. The family does not have cash. Cash, in Dakota Territory, in 1881, is rare. The crops are not yet paying. The railroad wages are small. The blind school is far away. Laura, in the summer of 1881, sat down at a sewing table in a dry goods store in De Smet. She sewed shirt buttonholes. She sewed them all day, 6 days a week. She was paid 25 cents a day plus her dinner, $1.50 a week, $9 for the summer. The books would later describe this as a charming episode. Laura earning her keep. Laura being spunky. Laura multiplying her wages in her head and feeling pleased. Here is what the books did not put next to that number. The 25 cents were buying Mary's future. The 25 cents was paying to put Mary on a train across 2 territories to a school in Iowa, where Mary would learn to read with her fingers, to play the organ, to walk through a room without sitting frozen in a chair waiting for someone to move her. The wage was a child's wage. The labour was child labour. The 14-year-old paying for her sister's education was a child paying an adult bill, with her own childhood as the currency. and the connection to Freddie is the connection the books could not make. The family had buried Freddie in August of 1876. Mary had gone blind in February of 1879. Laura had sat down at the sewing table in the summer of 1881. 5 years, 3 catastrophes, a baby brother dead, a sister blind, a childhood put on the line to pay for the sister's future. The books, written in the 1930s and 1940s, would have had to acknowledge the connection. The books written as children's books could not. So the connection was cut. The books made the sewing table charming. The books made Mary's blindness graceful. The books made Freddie disappear. The books, in the end, made the Ingalls family into the family the country wanted to believe the frontier had produced, not the family the frontier had actually produced. Here is what Laura wrote when she finally tried to write the actual family. The year is 1930. Laura Ingalls Wilder is 63 years old. She's living on Rocky Ridge Farm outside Mansfield, Missouri, with her husband Almanzo, who was partially paralysed from a stroke he suffered in 1889 and from a bout of diphtheria that same year. The farm is small. The farm has been a working farm, but it has not been a profitable farm. Laura has been writing for farm magazines for years, small articles, columns, pieces about rural life. She has been a columnist for the Missouri Ruralist. She has been, in her own way, a writer. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, is a successful writer. Rose is 43. Rose has been a journalist, a novelist, a political writer. Rose has travelled the world. Rose has, in the late 1920s, urged her mother to write down her childhood memories. Rose has typed the manuscript. Rose has edited the manuscript. Rose has shopped the manuscript to publishers. The manuscript is called Pioneer Girl. It is a first-person non-fiction account of Laura's childhood, from her birth in the big woods of Wisconsin in 1867 through her marriage to Almanzo Wilder in 1885. It is the manuscript that contains, on a single page, the sentence about Freddie. It is the manuscript that contains the Burr Oak year. It is the manuscript that contains the saloon fire, the doctor's wife, the midnight flit, the sewing table, and every other scene that the published books would later cut. The manuscript is rejected. The publishers, in 1930, do not want a first-person non-fiction account of a frontier childhood. The country is in the Great Depression. The country is not, the publishers believe, in the mood for grim non-fiction about grasshopper plagues and buried babies and saloon fires. The country is in the mood for, the publishers believe, something else. Laura and Rose regroup. They decide to rewrite the manuscript as children's books. They decide to keep the optimism. They decide to cut the grim parts. They decide to make the family into the family the country wanted to believe the frontier had produced. They decide to skip Burr Oak. They decide to skip Freddie. They decide to skip the saloon fire. They decide to skip the doctor's wife. They decide to skip the midnight flit. They decide to skip the sewing table wage labour. They decide, in short, to write the books that would sell. The first Little House book, Little House in the Big Woods, was published in 1932. The second, Farmer Boy, in 1933. The third, Little House on the Prairie, in 1935. The fourth, On the Banks of Plum Creek, in 1937. The fourth book ends with the family at Walnut Grove. The fifth book, By the Shores of Silver Lake, published in 1939, opens with the family in Dakota Territory. Between the end of the fourth book and the beginning of the fifth book, 3 years of the family's life are missing. The years that contained Freddie's death. The years that contained Burr Oak. The years that contained Mary's blindness. The skip was not an oversight. The skip was a choice. The choice was made by Laura and Rose together in letters in 1937 and 1938, while they were working on By the Shores of Silver Lake. The letters are in the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa. Rose Wilder Lane was 31 years old when she urged her mother to write down her childhood memories. That was in 1917. Laura was 50. Nothing came of it then. Rose went back to her own work. Laura went back to the farm. In 1928, Rose came back to Rocky Ridge Farm. She had quit her job as a travelling journalist. She had built a writing career. She had, in the late 1920s, the kind of editorial instincts that a manuscript needed. She sat her mother down at the kitchen table and told her to write. Laura wrote. She wrote in longhand on lined tablets, in the same careful schoolteacher hand she'd learned at the school in Walnut Grove and De Smet. She wrote the big woods. She wrote the Prairie. She wrote Plum Creek. She wrote the Grasshoppers. She wrote the long winter. She wrote the years between. She wrote Burr Oak. She wrote Freddie. She wrote the Saloon fire. She wrote the doctor's wife. She wrote the Midnight Flit. She wrote the sewing table. She wrote the marriage. Rose typed the manuscript. Rose edited it. Rose shopped it to publishers in New York. The publishers in 1930 said no. The publishers said the country was not in the mood for grim non-fiction about the frontier. The country was in the middle of the Great Depression. The country wanted, the publishers said, something else. Rose and Laura regrouped. They decided to rewrite the manuscript as children's books. They decided to keep the optimism. They decided to cut the grim parts. The decision was, by every account that survives, made jointly. Laura knew what she was cutting. Rose knew what Laura was cutting. They both knew that the cut was the price of getting published. The letters between them in the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library show two women negotiating the cut. The letters show Laura suggesting scenes. The letters show Rose suggesting cuts. The letters show the two of them, mother and daughter, working out line by line what the books would contain and what the books would not contain. The Burr Oak year was cut. Freddie was cut. The Saloon fire was cut. The doctor's wife was cut. The Midnight Flit was cut. The sewing table in its real form was cut. The actual cause of Mary's blindness was cut. What was kept was the family. What was kept was the optimism. What was kept was the fiddle and the lamp and the prairie. What was kept was the version of the Ingalls family that the country, in the middle of the Great Depression, wanted to believe the frontier had produced. Rose has been, in the years since, both credited and blamed for the cut. She has been credited, by some scholars, with shaping the raw material into the books that sold. She has been blamed, by some readers, for pushing her mother to soften the truth. The truth is probably simpler. Rose and Laura were both professionals. They both knew what they were doing. They both knew that the books to sell had to be the books. They both knew that the truth, to be the truth, had to wait. The truth waited in a drawer for 84 years. The letters show two women, mother and daughter, both writers, both professionals, both knowing exactly what they were cutting and why. The cut was made because the cut had to be made. The books could not have absorbed Burr Oak. The books could not have absorbed a baby brother dying. The books could not have absorbed a saloon fire. The books could not have absorbed a doctor's wife offering to take a daughter. The books could not have absorbed a midnight flit. The books could not have absorbed a 14-year-old sewing for 25 cents a day to pay for her blind sister's education. The books could not have absorbed the truth, and still have been the books. So, the truth was cut, and the books were written, and the books sold 60 million copies, and the books became an American religion. But the cut was not, in the end, complete, because Laura in 1930 in the original Pioneer Girl manuscript had written the sentence, and the manuscript, although rejected, was not destroyed. The manuscript sat in a drawer. The manuscript went to the Hoover Library. The manuscript was read, occasionally by scholars. The manuscript in 2014 was finally published. Here is what was in it. October 16th, 1937. Laura Ingalls. Wilder is 70 years old. She's in Detroit, at a book fair, in a department store. She's giving one of the few public speeches of her career. She stands at a podium. The room is full. She is by this point the author of 4 published Little House books. She's becoming famous. She's becoming, in the way that children's authors of her generation became famous, a kind of secular saint. The audience has come to hear the woman who wrote the books they read to their children, and Laura in the speech says this, quote, "All I have told is true, but it is not the whole truth. There were some stories I wanted to tell but would not be responsible for putting in a book for children." End quote. The line is famous now in Wilder scholarship. The line is cited as Laura's own implicit acknowledgement that she had censored her own material. The line is cited as the moment when Laura, in public, admitted that the books were not the whole truth. She did not, in the speech, name Freddie. She did not name Burr Oak. She did not name the Saloon fire. She did not name the doctor's wife. She did not name the Midnight Flit. She did not name the sewing table. She did not name any of the specific things she had cut. She just said, in front of a room full of strangers, that she had not told the whole truth. Read that line again. All I have told is true, but it is not the whole truth. That is not the line of a woman who has forgotten. That is not the line of a woman who has moved on. That is the line of a woman who is still carrying the cut, who is still aware of the cut, who is, in a room full of strangers, in the only public speech of her career that anyone would remember, quietly acknowledging the cut. The speech was given on the 16th of October, 1937. By that point, 4 Little House books had been published. The 5th, By the Shores of Silver Lake, was being written. The 5th book would be the book that officially skipped Burr Oak. The 5th book would be the book that sealed the cut. Laura knew what she was doing. Rose knew what Laura was doing. They both knew, in 1937, in 1938, in 1939, when By the Shores of Silver Lake was published, that the book would land in the hands of children who would never know about Freddie, who would never know about Burr Oak, who would never know about the Saloon fire or the doctor's wife or the Midnight Flit. The book landed. The book was a success. The book became part of the canon. The book is today still in print. The book is today still read by children who do not know about Freddie. That is the cut. That is the choice. That is the silence that Laura carried for the rest of her life. Here is the rest of the silence. Between 1932 and 1943, Laura Ingalls Wilder published 9 Little House books. Little House in the Big Woods, 1932. Farmer Boy, 1933. Little House on the Prairie, 1935. On the Banks of Plum Creek, 1937. By the Shores of Silver Lake, 1939. The Long Winter, 1940. Little Town on the Prairie, 1941. These Happy Golden Years, 1943. The First 4 Years, written in the early 1940s and published posthumously in 1971. Freddie appears in none of them. Burr Oak appears in none of them. The Saloon fire appears in none of them. The doctor's wife appears in none of them. The Midnight Flit appears in none of them. The sewing table wage labour appears in none of them, in the form it actually took. The sewing table does appear in These Happy Golden Years, but it is presented as a charming summer job, not as child labour paying for a blind sister's education. Mary's blindness appears, but the cause is changed. Scarlet fever is the cause in the books. The actual cause, almost certainly viral meningoencephalitis, is not in the books. The grasshopper plagues appear in On the Banks of Plum Creek, but their full effect on the family is not in the books. The locusts come, the locusts go, the family endures. The books do not show the family selling the farm and running to Iowa. The books were, in every sense, a success. The books sold 60 million copies. The books were translated into dozens of languages. The books were adapted into a television show that ran for 9 seasons. The books became the basis of a tourist industry that runs through Pepin, Wisconsin and Independence, Kansas and Walnut Grove, Minnesota and De Smet, South Dakota and Mansfield, Missouri. The books made Laura Ingalls Wilder into the most trusted voice in American memory of the frontier. The books did not contain her brother. The books did not contain the town he died in. The books did not contain the hotel his mother worked in. The books did not contain the year that broke the family. The books did not contain the truth. But the books were true. That is the part that is hard to hold. The books were true. Almost everything in them is grounded in something that actually happened. Laura did grow up on the frontier. She did live in the big woods. She did live on the prairie. She did live at Plum Creek. She did live through the long winter. She did meet Almanzo. She did marry him. The books are not lies. The books are selections. The books are the true parts that Laura and Rose chose to keep, with the true parts that they chose to cut lying in a drawer in West Branch, Iowa, for 80 years. The cut was the choice. The choice was the silence. The silence was the book. Now see what happened to the silence. Caroline Lake Ingalls died on the 20th of April 1924 at the home of her daughter Carrie in Keystone, South Dakota. She was 84 years old. She had outlived Freddie by 47 years, 7 months, and 24 days. She had outlived her husband Charles, who had died in 1902 at the age of 66, by 22 years. She had outlived her daughter Mary, who had died in 1928 at the age of 63 by 4 years. Actually, that is not correct. Mary was still alive when Caroline died. Mary would die in 1928. Caroline would die first in 1924. Caroline would die knowing that Mary, blind and unmarried, was still living, still dependent on the family. She had outlived her son-in-law Almanzo's paralysis by 35 years. She had outlived the Burr Oak year by 46 years, and she had spent all of those 46 years carrying the loss of Freddie. William Anderson, the Wilder biographer, recorded what Caroline told relatives in her old age. She told them, "If Freddie had lived, everything would be different." Anderson noted that she was still saying this nearly 40 years after Freddie's death. She was still saying it when her daughters were grown. She was still saying it when Laura was a young woman. She was still saying it when the family had finally settled in De Smet. She was still saying it when Grace, the baby she'd been carrying through the Burr Oak year, was herself a grown woman. 40 years, 47 years by the time she died. Caroline Ingalls carried the loss of her only son for the rest of her life. Here is the thing about Caroline that the books cannot absorb. Caroline was not Ma. Caroline was a 36-year-old woman who'd grown up fatherless, who had married a restless man, who had followed that man to 4 territories in 10 years, and who was now, in October of 1876, walking into a hotel basement in a town she had not chosen, 2 months after burying her only son, almost certainly pregnant with her 5th child, with 3 daughters under the age of 11 in tow, and a husband who was, by every account that survives, increasingly aware that he had run out of moves. Caroline was the brake on Charles's wagon. Caroline was also the one who had to pack the wagon every time Charles decided to move. Caroline was the one who had to set up the household, again in the new place. Caroline was the one who had to find the school, find the church, find the doctor, find the neighbour woman who would stand by her when the next baby came. Caroline was the one who kept the family's calendar. Caroline was the one who knew, on any given day, how much flour was in the barrel, how much wood was in the pile, how much money was owed at the store, how many days until the next payment was due. In Walnut Grove, Caroline had a household. In Burr Oak, Caroline had a hotel kitchen. In Walnut Grove, Caroline had a dugout she had made into a home, with quilts on the beds and a parlour in the corner and a garden by the door. In Burr Oak, Caroline had a basement bedroom with a single window looking at a hillside, and a cook stove that was not hers, and a pantry that was not hers, and a saloon next door that was not hers either, but that came through the wall every night. Caroline was a woman who had built homes out of nothing, again and again, and who had been told in the summer of 1876 that the home she had built in Walnut Grove was gone. She had built it for 5 years. She had hung quilts. She had planted a garden. She had watched her daughters grow in it. She had buried her son from it. And now it was sold to a stranger for whatever Charles could get, and the quilts were in the wagon, and the garden was someone else's, and the dugout on Plum Creek was someone else's dugout, and the family was in Iowa. Caroline, in the hotel basement, did not cry where anyone could see her. That is not the way the women of her generation on the frontier mourned. She worked, she cooked, she did the laundry, she carried the new baby, she kept the calendar, she knew how much flour was in the barrel, she knew how much wood was in the pile, she knew how much money was owed at the store, and she did not, in any of the books her daughter would later write, get to say what she was carrying. The books have Ma. The books do not have Caroline. She carried it through the rest of the moves. She carried it through Mary's blindness. She carried it through Laura's marriage. She carried it through the publication of the first 2 Little House books. She carried it through the death of her husband. She carried it in her body, in her face, in the way she sat at the table, in the way she held her grandchildren until the 20th of April 1924 in Keystone, South Dakota, when she stopped carrying it. The books do not have this Caroline. The books have a steady, neat, careful mother who makes do and never complains. The books do not have a mother who, in private conversations with relatives, says, if Freddie had lived 40 years after the fact. The books do not have a mother who carries a dead baby in her memory for half a century. The books do not have a mother whose grief is a piece of furniture in the house of her mind. The books have Ma. The books do not have Caroline. That is the cut. That is the silence. That is what Laura, writing the books, could not put in. Because if she had put Caroline's grief in, the books would have had to put Freddie in. And if the books had put Freddie in, the books would have had to put Burr Oak in. And if the books had put Burr Oak in, the books would have had to put the Saloon fire in, and the doctor's wife in, and the Midnight Flit in, and the whole long, grim year that the family had spent in a declining Iowa town running a hotel for drunk men. So Caroline's grief was cut, and Caroline, in the books, became Ma, and Ma was steady, neat, careful, and never complained. And Ma did not have a dead son, and Ma did not have a memory that lasted 47 years, and Ma was the mother the country wanted to believe the frontier had produced. Caroline died in 1924. She did not live to see the books published. She did not live to see the cut completed. She did not live to see Freddie erased from the canon. She died with his name still on her lips, in private, to relatives, in a small house in Keystone, South Dakota, 490 miles from the cemetery where he was buried. Here is the contrast the books could not hold. In the books, the Ingalls family moves west, Wisconsin to Kansas, to Wisconsin to Minnesota, to Dakota Territory. The movement is always forward. The movement is always toward the frontier. The movement is always, in the end, toward the family's future. In the record, the Ingalls family moves west, then east, then west again. The eastward move, in the summer of 1876, is a retreat. The eastward move is a family running from grasshoppers and debt, with a dead baby in their memory, to a hotel in a declining Iowa town. The eastward move does not fit the book's thesis. The eastward move is a family going backward. In the books, the Ingalls family is whole. The family has Ma and Pa and Mary and Laura and Carrie and eventually Grace. The family has 5 children. The family loses no one. The family in the books is the family that survived. In the record, the Ingalls family has 6 children. The family loses 1. The family that arrives in Dakota Territory in September of 1879 is not the family that left Wisconsin in 1874. The family that arrives in Dakota Territory is a family that has buried a baby, lost a farm, lost a year and a half to Iowa, lost a daughter's sight, and almost lost a daughter to a doctor's wife. The family that arrives is the family that survived, but the family that arrives is also the family that did not come out whole. In the books, Ma is steady and neat and careful and never complains. In the record, Caroline Ingalls is a woman who, for 47 years, says, if Freddie had lived, to relatives in private. In the books, Laura is the spunky pioneer girl who loves her father and loves the prairie. In the record, Laura is a 9-year-old who watches her baby brother die in a borrowed room, then watches her family run to a hotel in Iowa, then watches her sister go blind, then sits down at a sewing table at 14 to sew buttonholes for 25 cents a day to pay for the blind sister's education. In the books, the prairie makes the family strong. In the record, the prairie breaks the family and the family spends the rest of its life pretending it was not broken, and the family writes 9 books about the strength and 1 manuscript in a drawer about the breaking. That is the cut. That is the silence. That is the whole truth, Laura said in Detroit in 1937 that she had not told. Here is what happened to the manuscript. The year is 2014. It is November. The South Dakota Historical Society Press, a small academic press in Pierre, South Dakota, has just published a book called Pioneer Girl, the Annotated Autobiography. The book is edited by a Wilder scholar named Pamela Smith Hill. The book is the first publication of Laura Ingalls Wilder's 1930 manuscript, the one that was rejected, the one that contained Freddie, the one that contained Burr Oak, the one that contained the Saloon fire, the one that contained the doctor's wife, the one that contained the Midnight Flit. The book becomes a surprise bestseller. The first printing sells out in weeks. The press goes back to print. The press goes back to print again. By the end of the year, the book is one of the best-selling non-fiction titles in the United States. It is reviewed in the New York Times. It is reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. It is reviewed in every major newspaper in the country. The book is, for the first time, the truth. The book is what Laura wrote in 1930 before the cut. The book is the version that contains Freddie. The book is the version that contains Burr Oak. The book is the version that contains the sentence, the only sentence, that Laura ever wrote about her brother's death. One awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead. The book is purchased in its first year by hundreds of thousands of readers. The book is, by every measure, a publishing phenomenon. The book is the version of Laura's childhood that the country had not been allowed to read for 84 years. And here is the part that is hard to sit with. Most of the people who bought the book did not finish it. The book is dense. The book is annotated. The book is 500 pages long with footnotes, with commentary, with scholarly apparatus. The book is not the children's books. The book does not read like the children's books. The book is the raw manuscript, the rejected manuscript, the manuscript that was too grim for the Depression-era publishers. The sentence about Freddie is in there. The sentence is on a page near the middle. The sentence is, in the published version, surrounded by Pamela Smith Hill's annotations. The annotations explain where Freddie was born, when he died, where he was buried, what the Wabasha County death record says, what Laura wrote about him, what Laura did not write about him in the books. The sentence is there. The sentence is in print. The sentence has been in print for 12 years. Most readers will never open to that page. The erasure, in other words, has been undone. The sentence is available. The truth is available. Anyone who wants to read the sentence about Freddie can read it. Anyone who wants to know about Burr Oak can know about it. Anyone who wants to know what Laura wrote before the cut can read what Laura wrote. Here is what the publication of Pioneer Girl did in the years after 2014. It opened the drawer. It put the truth in print. It allowed scholars finally to compare what Laura wrote in 1930 with what Laura published between 1932 and 1943. It allowed readers finally to read the sentence about Freddie. It allowed the cut finally to be visible. But it did not undo the cut. The cut is still the canon. The canon is still the 9 books. The 9 books are still in print. The 9 books are still read by children. The 9 books are still the version of the Ingalls family that the country carries in its memory. The Pioneer Girl manuscript is, in a sense, a scholarly text. It is not a children's book. It is not the book a parent reads to a child at bedtime. It is the book a Wilder scholar reads in a library with footnotes. It is the book a serious reader picks up after they have read the 9 books and want to know what was left out. It is the book that the country, in 2014, briefly bought in large numbers and then mostly did not finish. The truth is in print. The truth is on a page most readers will never open. The truth is in a sentence Laura wrote once, in 1930, in longhand, on a lined tablet, in a farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri, when she was 63 years old and trying to remember a summer day in 1876 when she was 9. That is the truth. That is the whole truth Laura said in Detroit in 1937 that she had not told. The truth is in print. The brother is still in the ground. But the erasure has not been undone in the way that matters. The erasure has not been undone in the canon. The erasure has not been undone in the books that children read. The erasure has not been undone in the television show. The erasure has not been undone in the tourist brochures. The erasure has not been undone in the cultural memory of the country. The erasure has not been undone in the minds of the millions of people who grew up with the Little House books and who do not know that Laura had a baby brother. The sentence is in print. The brother is still in the ground. Here is the ground. The cemetery is in Section 24 of Zumbro Township, Wabasha County, Minnesota. It is called, in different records, Pleasant Prairie Cemetery, or Dale Cemetery, or South Troy Cemetery. The cemetery is on a low rise above the Zumbro River. The cemetery has a few hundred burials. The oldest stones date to the 1850s. The newest are recent. The cemetery has a church next to it. The church is the South Troy Wesleyan Church. The church has a historical marker. The church has, near its entrance, a memorial stone for Freddie Ingalls. The memorial stone does not mark the grave. The memorial stone acknowledges that Freddie is buried somewhere in the cemetery. The replica death certificate is mounted near the marker. The death certificate shows the name Fred Ingalls misspelled. The death certificate shows the age as 10 months. The death certificate shows the cause of death as diarrhea. The death certificate shows the date as the 27th of August, 1876. The grave, if there was a marker, is unmarked now. The wood, if it was wood, is gone. The limestone, if it was limestone, is not in the cemetery in any form that can be identified. The exact location of the grave is not known. The Ingalls family did not own a plot. They buried the baby in whatever corner the cemetery had for strangers' children. The cemetery is small. The cemetery is quiet. The cemetery is in a part of Minnesota that has been losing population for 100 years. The town of South Troy, which was never much of a town, has nearly disappeared. The church still holds services. The cemetery still takes occasional burials. The historical marker still stands. The replica death certificate still hangs. Visitors come, occasionally. Visitors who have read the books. Visitors who have heard somewhere that Laura had a baby brother. Visitors who drive out of their way on a vacation through Minnesota to find the cemetery and stand in front of the marker. The visitors are usually alone or in pairs. The visitors do not stay long. There is not much to see. There is a stone with a name on it. There is a death certificate with a misspelled name on it. There is a cemetery with an unmarked grave in it. The brother is in there somewhere. A 9-month-old baby, born in a dugout on Plum Creek. In a town the family loved. In a year the family hoped would be the year that finally worked. A baby who was the only son. A baby who was the 4th child. A baby who was named for his father and for his grandfather. A baby who was called Freddie. A baby who was not well on a summer day in 1876 at a borrowed farm in a borrowed room. A baby who straightened out his little body and was dead. A baby who was buried in a stranger's cemetery. A baby whose sister, 60 years later, wrote one sentence about him and then never wrote another. A baby whose mother carried his loss for 47 years, until she died in a small house in Keystone, South Dakota. A baby whose grave is unmarked. A baby whose name is misspelled in the county record. A baby whose story, tonight, you have now heard. Here is what the silence cost in the end. The silence cost the country a true version of one of its founding myths. The Ingalls family in the books became the family the country wanted to believe the frontier had produced. The Ingalls family in the record was a family that lost a baby, lost a farm, lost a daughter's sight, lost a year and a half to a hotel in a declining Iowa town, and almost lost a daughter to a doctor's wife. The country, raised on the books, grew up believing the frontier made families strong. The country did not grow up knowing what the frontier cost. The silence cost the Ingalls family their grief. Carolyn carried the grief for 47 years, in private, in conversations with relatives, in the phrase, "if Freddie had lived." Laura carried the grief for 60 years, in a manuscript she could not sell, in a sentence she wrote once and never wrote again. Mary carried the grief in the form of her blindness for 49 years, until she died in 1928. Carrie carried the grief in the form of the small, sickly body that had been hers since childhood, until she died in 1946. Grace, the baby who was born in the Bisbee house in May of 1877, the baby who replaced the baby who was gone, carried the grief in the form of being the daughter who was always in the shadow of the brother she never knew. Grace died in 1941. The silence cost Freddie his name. He is in the county record as Fred Ingalls. He is in the family Bible as Charles Frederick. He is in the Pioneer Girl manuscript as Freddie. He is in the memorial stone at the South Troy Wesleyan Church as Charles Frederick Ingalls. He is in the books as no one. He is tonight in your memory as the brother Laura erased. That is the only place in 150 years that he has been carried by anyone outside the family. That is the cost of the silence. The silence made the books possible. The silence made the family famous. The silence made the country believe the frontier was a place of optimism and resilience. The silence also erased a baby. The silence also erased a mother's grief. The silence also erased a year and a half of a family's life. The silence also erased a hotel, a saloon, a fire, a doctor's wife, a midnight flit, a sewing table, and a cemetery in southeast Minnesota. The silence, in the end, is the story. Here is the end. You were told the books were the true story of Laura Ingalls Wilder's childhood. They are not the whole truth. Laura herself, in 1937, in a room full of strangers, said so. All I have told is true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is this. The Ingalls family, between August of 1876 and February of 1879, lost a baby, lost a farm, lost a year and a half of their lives to a declining Iowa town, lost a daughter's sight, and almost lost a daughter to a doctor's wife who offered to take her. They lost, in the space of 30 months, almost everything that a frontier family could lose without actually dying. And then they got back in the wagon, and they kept going. The wagon went east in 1876, to a town the books would never mention, with a dead baby behind them and a live baby in Caroline's belly. The wagon went back west in January of 1878, in the year without a winter, on muddy roads with debts they had skipped out on. The wagon went west again in September of 1879 to Dakota Territory, to a town that would become De Smet, to the claim shanty on the prairie that would become the setting for the books that would make the family famous. The books are about the wagon going west. The books are about the family that survived. The books are about the optimism and the resilience and the fiddle and the lamp in the window. The books are not about the wagon going east. The books are not about the year the family did not survive, the year that broke them, the year they spent in a hotel basement cooking for drunk men with a dead baby in their memory and a new baby in their arms. The books are not about Caroline saying, in private to relatives for 47 years, if Freddie had lived. The books are not about the sentence. The sentence is in a manuscript, in a drawer, in a library in West Branch, Iowa for 84 years. The sentence was finally published in 2014. The sentence is on a page near the middle of a 500-page annotated scholarly edition that most readers will never finish. The sentence is in print. The sentence has been in print for 12 years. The brother is still in the ground in South Troy. The brother has been in the ground for 150 years. The brother was the only son. The brother was the fourth child. The brother was 9 months old. The brother died on a summer day in a borrowed room. The brother was buried in a stranger's cemetery. The brother was never mentioned in the 9 books that made his family into an American religion. The brother was mentioned once, in a manuscript that was rejected, in a sentence that Laura wrote and then never wrote again. The books made Laura Ingalls Wilder the most trusted voice in American memory. The books skipped the year that broke her family. The sentence she wrote about her brother, the only sentence, is still in print, on a page most readers will never turn to. The brother is still in the ground in South Troy. The wagon went east in 1876. It never came back the same. The books are true. They are not the whole truth. The whole truth has been in a drawer for 84 years and in print for 12. The whole truth is on a page most people will never open. The whole truth is in a cemetery most people will never visit. The whole truth is in a sentence Laura wrote once, and then never wrote again. One awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead. She wrote that once. She never wrote it again. The books came out without him. The books sold 60 million copies. The brother stayed in the ground. That is the cut. That is the silence. That is the whole truth the books could not hold. Good night.